Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Island of Ideas public talk series and tonight's conversation, Tasmania's Hidden History, Art, Power and Truth. My name is Greg Lehman. I'm a Professorial Fellow of Indigenous Research here at the University of Tasmania. Firstly, I'd like to welcome you to the lands of the Muwinina people here on the Sandy Bay campus, a place that the Muwinina knew as Kriwa, which, according to Warrady, was the location of a large Aboriginal village near what we now call Little Sandy Bay, before the arrival of the British at Nipaluna, which is now referred to as Solomon's Cove. I also hold the role of UNESCO Chair of Communication, Environment and Heritage. And tonight's event is very much within my brief to support better understandings and community engagement with our natural and cultural heritage. Tonight is about the stories that we tell about the places, the events and the people who have shaped who we are. Many of you will have come here tonight because of the controversy over the reputation of colonial surgeon and entrepreneur William Crowther. But tonight is actually not about Crowther or the unceremonious way that his statue was brought down. Tonight is more about the place that the statue of Crowther once stood and where another colonial statue of a previous governor of Tasmania, Sir John Franklin, still stands. This is Hobart's most important civic square, with its own history and defining importance in the city's identity. Tonight is about what stories we want to tell about this square, the city and our own history and heritage. So let's start with the Crowther statue before we move forward with tonight's speakers and conversation. In 2016, artist Sidham Ademir brought a project that she had commenced in Cape Town, South Africa. She brought this to Hobart as part of the 2016 Dark Mofo Festival. The artist wrapped the statue of Crowther along with Franklin and several others in Franklin Square and Salamanca in pink plastic. Her aim was to draw critical attention, in her view, to the blind reverence paid to often disreputable men who served imperial interests. Inspired by this project, in 2019, I suggested that the city commission a series of artistic interventions to stimulate public conversation on the contemporary understandings and attitudes to Crowther's statue, which had been surrounded in controversy for many years, and to, most importantly, explore options for its future. Tasmanian Aboriginal artist Julie Goff was among 5 artists involved in these creative interventions. Her work, Breathing Space, expressed Julie's desire for the statue to be removed and involved crating it up, seemingly ready to be picked up for storage, for transport and storage. I worked with the late and wonderful Tasmanian filmmaker and sculptor Roger Scholes on another work, which instead of focusing on Crowther, sought to interpret and celebrate the life of William Lanne, whose rich life story is usually completely overshadowed by the story of Crowther and the theft of Lanne's remains from the colonial hospital mortuary. After a range of public consultations, the City of Hobart Council has voted on a number of occasions to remove the statue from its place in Franklin Square. The Tasmanian Civil and Administrative Tribunal then considered and rejected an appeal against its removal. However, on the night before the tribunal's decision was announced, a vigilante action by unknown activists resulted in the statue being cut down in the dead of night. As a result, Australia's first removal of a colonial statue was hijacked, resulting in an ignominious end to Crowther's presence in the square and to the democratic process that was to result in its removal. I think it's safe to say that it left many people unhappy for many different reasons. So to the important question, what is next? What do we do next in the wake of these events? Do we install public interpretation of these very events to make a record of the processes that were at play? Do we commission new statues of other prominent figures, public figures? Do we commission inspiring and wonderful public art that many other capital cities in Hobart are known and celebrated for? But most importantly, what stories do we want to tell? What stories do we want to tell about our own history and heritage and who we are and who we aspire to be? How do we tell those stories? And why do we want to tell them? I'd now like to introduce our first speaker for this evening, Dr. Cassandra Pybus. Cassandra is an award-winning non-fiction author and a distinguished historian. She's the author of 13 books, including the best-selling biography Truganini, and has held research professorships at the University of Sydney, Georgetown University in Washington, DC, the University of Texas, and King's College London. Cassandra is descended from a colonist who received the largest free land grant on Truganini's traditional country of Bruny Island. Her most recent book, A Very Secret Trade, uncovers some of the darkest and best kept secrets in Australia's colonial history. Welcome, Cassandra.
This is a sculpture called Two Islands by Nigel Hellier, installed in 2018 when it was commissioned with the aim of, quote, representing the tangible and intangible layers of history and meaning in Franklin Square as a part of the Franklin Square master plan of that year, 2018. The artwork comprises three components: a scale timber hull of the wreck of HMS Erebus, the second part, a full scale of an Aboriginal canoe in steel, and 3, it's got a motion-triggered soundscape. As you might have noticed, if you walk close to it, it starts to make sounds. What these sounds are is, depending on how much time you spend there, you might be able to work out. At the time, our chair, Greg Lehman, gave feedback on this piece, writing approvingly that the use of watercraft to symbolise Indigenous and settler colonial cultures has deep resonance with the history of both cultures, end quote. Now, the replica canoe is certainly a very potent symbol for all the reasons that Greg goes on to say. Although it is odd to be cast in metal, I thought, but what in heaven's name does HMS Erebus have to do with settler colonial culture in Tasmania? In my opinion, it's nothing at all. That ship, as you probably know, was destroyed in pack ice in 1846, along with its sister ship HMS Terror, during a quixotic expedition to locate the Northwest Passage in the Arctic, leading all 129 officers and crew into unspeakable trauma and painful death, which only became known a decade later when some pieces of dreadful evidence were finally found, just some tiny pieces of evidence. The flimsy connection of Hobart to Erebus is, of course, that the park is named for the ill-fated, and some would say incompetent, leader of that expedition, Sir John Franklin, who is also honoured with a central statue. Now, I would argue that the use of Franklin's ship as a symbol for settler experience in Tasmania is completely nonsensical, and equally it is symptomatic of a historical disconnect represented by Franklin Square itself. The square was originally created on a piece of land named George Square to serve as a muster ground and site of the original government house. After that building was demolished in 1858, the Parliament decided to create a central public space as a significant meeting place for a growing colony, and this is the important thing about that, a growing colony that is now freed from its penal origin story. No more talking about convicts. A matter of concern was the discussion in the Parliament about how to centre this public space in the imagination of the colonists. Resolution to that came unexpectedly in a letter from Lady Jane Franklin, who was a most determined woman, and she'd secured the command of the Arctic expedition for her corpulent and ageing husband, just as she had finagled his knighthood and his appointment as governor to Van Diemen's Land in 1837. He held that position until early 1843, when he was unceremoniously recalled following years of vituperative controversy about his favouritism, his incompetence, and mostly the unbecoming influence of his wife. The best that his friends could say was that he was a well-meaning old gentleman enthralled to his dominating wife. Symptomatic of the widespread poor opinion were the convicts who were mustered before the governor in the morning and openly ridiculed him as an old fool who was such a glutton that he was said to eat 2 sheep for his dinner each night, as reported by the American convict Linus Miller. I might note that Franklin was the first officer, in fact died long before anybody else, when his ships were abandoned along with all their tinned food. Doubtless he had eaten more than his equal share of what was found to be botulism-contaminated rations. It is a terrible story, this one, if you don't know it. For a decade, Lady Franklin had ensured that the colonial media in Tasmania were kept abreast of her efforts to find Sir John, transforming her from a manipulative she-devil into an indefatigable heroine. So, in 1859, when she finally got the evidence that Franklin had died in June 1847, she shifted gears into memorialising. That year, she wrote to the Premier of Tasmania to propose the transfer of her property on Betsy Island on the condition that a sum of £500 was expended in the erecting of a statue to Sir John upon that site. The Parliament was unanimous in determining to deal with the matter in a more generous spirit, proposing that they would double the money and put the monument on the site of the old government house. In 1860, a parliamentary resolution was passed dedicating funds for the creation of a statue as the centrepiece for a central park created in the honour of the failed Arctic explorer Sir John Franklin. Lady Franklin had already been active in the same cause in England, where a sculptor named Matthew Noble had been employed by her to prepare a national monument to Sir John as an Arctic explorer to be erected in his birthplace of Lincolnshire. It was decided that the colony could get a duplicate, which would be a damn sight more cheaper than commissioning an original. The Mercury newspaper greeted the newfound adoration of Franklin with approval, albeit the editor did note, quote, the diversity of opinion, end quote, about his worthiness of such an honour, given his poor record as governor, but insisted, quote, in the light of his later deeds and of his heroic end, we must interpret every act of his character in the commission of the Queen as adherence to the same rule of obedience of which Nelson and Wellington are great examples. Well, now, I'm not convinced that this word salad of rhetorical special pleading did anything to quiet the diversity of opinion about the worthiness of Franklin, but nevertheless, the levelling of the site for the Franklin Monument went ahead, as the Mercury reported, quote, the large gum trees which have been left growing since first settlement of the colony are now in the process of removal. Indeed, these indigenous trees were replaced with English oaks, elms and elders, while other European species were added later. The duplicate statue was delivered and installed to great fanfare in 1863. The elaborate fountain with which we are all familiar was installed to surround it very much later. Now, to the tale of the second statue of Dr. William Crowther, erected on the 9th of January 1889. This statue was not a government initiative, far from it. Honouring Dr. Crowther would have been the last thing the Premier, James Agnew, long-standing Secretary of the Royal Society of Tasmania, would have countenanced. Agnew detested Crowther on the many grounds, but not the least of which was his stealing the skull of William Lanne, which Agnew believed should belong to the Royal Society, given that they owned the rest of the skeleton of Lanne. He had directed Dr. Skokul to cut off the hands and feet of Lanne in the hospital, and also the secret removal of his body from the grave. He wanted the full skeleton of Lanne to complement the skeleton of the Indigenous woman known as Patty, whose body the Royal Society had already stolen from the hospital in 1867. It was Agnew who had engineered the removal of the skeleton of Truganini for the Royal Society in 1878. Now, don't worry, folks, I have written and said all that I have to say on those matters. My intention here is to consider Crowther's statue in relation to the statue of Franklin. I believe the choice of the placement of the statue in Franklin Square in a direct sightline of the Franklin statue is strategic. It was erected and paid for by public subscription, directed by both an appreciative constituency as well as prominent business and political associates who were very active in the Hobart Council, which was a power base for Crowther throughout his whole political career. All of these people lauded him for his medical and political work that he'd done over his lifetime. William Crowther had arrived in Tasmania as a boy, and except for a couple of years of medical training in London, he spent his life in Hobart, where he displayed genuine concern for the health and well-being of the poor and did much to assist them free of charge, which did entrench him as a public figure amongst the plebeian majority of the town. He was also an energetic entrepreneur and the recipient of the prestigious gold medal of the Royal College of Surgeons in London for his contributions as a naturalist. That's his contribution of marine specimens. In Hobart, Crowther maintained a raucous base of support amongst labourers and tradesmen in the town, as well as businessmen and other entrepreneurs, particularly in the whaling fraternity. The labourers and tradesmen of the town were deeply suspicious of the entrenched elites for their open disdain of the emancipist class. Under a reformist banner, Crowther was overwhelmingly elected to the House of Assemblies as a member for Hobart in 1866, but resigned after a disagreement with the Premier. He stood again for Hobart's seat in the Legislative Council in 1869, winning another massive majority, and as a hugely popular member, briefly Premier for only 10 months, he held the seat until his death. The statue to Crowther was an original bronze commissioned by a sculptor from England that arrived in Hobart in January 1887. It was unveiled by Premier Philip Fish, who was one of Crowther's political allies, and I believe that the position of the statue within the grounds of Franklin Square in a direct sightline of the Franklin statue was a deliberate move by Premier Fish. The unveiling was a huge public event. A lengthy report in the Mercury carried no suggestion of any diversity of opinion. Indeed, it extolled the size of the enthusiastic crowd, reproducing at length the extravagant praise of the Premier, who concluded his extremely long speech by saying that the mass crowds were not there to, quote, behold the man, rather to acknowledge that he strove after what he believed to be right, and in the end he also spent his life trying to do good by his fellow citizens, end of quote. I am not alone in thinking it a historical contradiction that the statue removed from the central square in Hobart that dominated is dominated by the statue of a failed Arctic explorer, was a Tasmanian doctor, politician, businessman and naturalist, and it was commissioned and paid for by his admiring friends and constituents. Those who applaud the toppling of Dr. Crowther's statue insist that the man was a racist who committed a heinous act of stealing the skull of the last male of the first people of the island. And I would be the last person to deny that historical fact, as I made abundantly clear in my book, A Very Secret Trade. But let me add a few more historical facts to this discussion. First up, everyone in the colony was a racist. That's why Billy Lanne got to be the last surviving male of the original people within 60 years of European settlement. Secondly, Crowther believed that he was entirely within his rights as a consulting surgeon at the hospital to take Lanne's skull and at the same time the skull of one of his deceased patients. In so doing, he was following in the footsteps of colonial surgeons before him who stole the skeletal remains of First People as a matter of course. So too did other government appointees, including 3 governors. That is why there were so many Tasmanian skulls in overseas museums at the time that Crowther sought to add just one more. He had not anticipated that the Hunterian Museum in London did not want his skull because they had so many already. Before you start to chide me by saying that the honouring of Crowther with a prominent statue was so repugnant to public sensibility it demanded the statue's removal, let me draw your attention to the far more prominent statue in the middle of the square. It may surprise you to know, although it shouldn't surprise you, because the information has been on the public record for decades and decades, that the Hunterian Museum and the British Museum received gifts of Tasmanian skulls from the Franklin collection, that is the collection of Sir John and Lady Franklin, as well as the skulls of the first people of Victoria, South Australia and Western Australia. 2, and possibly 3, Tasmanian skulls that Lady Jane Franklin donated to the Hunterian Museum in 1854, interestingly, when she was drumming up scientific support for her research to find her lost husband. These were certainly supplied from Aboriginal establishment at Wyballina on Flinders Island. The Franklins made a very brief visit to Wyballina in early January 1838 at the instigation of Ronald Gunn. He was one of Lady Jane Franklin's proteges. She had quite a few young men who were her proteges, as the local newspapers like to gossip about. And Gunn was concerned about the exiled people, as he wrote to Sir Joseph Hooker on the 15th of February 1838, quote, "Unless Sir John, at an early day, adopts some remedial measures, the race in another season or 2 will become extinct," end of quote. Gunn's hope for Franklin was misplaced. The governor showed no meaningful interest in the well-being of the First People other than to cut their funding and lobbying the Governor of New South Wales to have them removed across Bass Strait to Victoria. The Franklins' true interest in the First People was made explicit in their parting words to the Commandant at Wyballina, George Augustus Robinson, who recorded in his journal that, quote, "They solicited curiosities and also the skull of an Aboriginal." Gunn would not have been surprised by this, since he knew that Lady Franklin had, quote, "no time for the blacks," as she called the First People. One aspect of the colony she found praiseworthy was that they'd all been removed, and I quote, "The scourge of all the other colonies without exception is the savages or the blacks, and the elimination of this scourge is only in Van Diemen's Land and should be considered in our favour," end of quote. That she wrote to her sister in December 1840. An entry in her diary recorded a dinner conversation in which she firmly stated her want of sympathy with those people who think it so very shocking that these inferior races of men should be gradually disappearing from the earth. I thought it was more that as specimens of natural history they were to be regretted, if nothing else. That is, the loss of them as specimens of natural history, end of quote. In the few weeks after the Franklins' visit, Robinson's journal recorded his attendance at the autopsies of 3 named people who died at Wibellina, where he instructed their bodies be decapitated and each head sent to an orderly to have the flesh removed and preserve the skull. It is my belief, and it is also the belief of other researchers such as N.J.B. Plomley, that Robinson took skulls to Hobart as a sweetener when he met with Franklin in August 1838 to plead his case to be awarded the position as Protector of Aborigines in Victoria. To conclude, I cannot see any moral distinction can be made between Crowther personally taking the skull of a dead Indigenous man and the Governor of the island ordering a subordinate official to take a skull for him. I ask you, is it repugnant to modern public sensibility that the statue of Sir John Franklin dominates the central square of Hobart, a square that proudly carries the Franklin name? I find it repugnant, and I would like to know what the people of Hobart think about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Cassandra, for raising the tricky question of who and what we choose to celebrate as part of our story as Tasmanians. To talk a little bit more about the site of all of this scandal and repugnancy, or otherwise, is Lee Woolley. Lee is a Tasmanian architect with over 35 years of professional experience as an architectural and urban design practitioner, author and educator. He's the recipient of numerous professional design awards across these disciplines, including the nationally awarded Building Heights Review for Central Hobart. A Churchill Fellow and Adjunct Professor in Architecture and Design here at the University of Tasmania, Lee is also a member of the Hobart City Council Urban Design Advisory Panel. I ask you to please welcome Lee Woolley.
Well, we're already hearing that the location of Franklin Square offers much more than merely a Victorian-era park. But I suggest that all cities are experienced as landscapes. So where they're located, not just how they've been made, demand consideration and review. Accordingly, this plan is an interpretation of the landform and contours of Central Hobart. It provides a foundation to the city centre, but also a context for its townscape. Importantly, it is in the city's planning scheme. And Franklin Square, there we go, worked, is located on the ridge above the reclaimed floor of Sullivan's Cove. But it is the scale of the layered regional landforms reinforced by the waterplane of the harbour that cradle our city. And the term that refers to the extended location and setting of Central Hobart, acknowledging its spatial experience, is the term urban amphitheatre. And this definition is also included in the city's planning scheme. Although unaware of the repository of knowledge they were sailing into, the landforms of Kununyi and Mount Direction provided bearing points or portals for Europeans as they moved into the landscape from the sea, initially establishing at the base of Mount Direction. And when they moved to the western shore and the land of the Muanina, it was plentiful fresh water that sustained them, as it had for more than 1,000 generations, of Tasmanian families before them. The precondition for a port city was there. Hunter Island in the foreground and the sand spit linking to the shore at low tide, and above them an escarpment offering a protected vantage point. Some 7.5 years later, in late 1811, a surveyor and former convict, James Meehan, was instructed to draw a plan for the town. His baseline was set from a tree he had marked years earlier, near the outflow of that abundant rivulet. This became the southwest-northeast alignment of Macquarie Street. The other principal alignment was generated in response to the then Government House. Aligned with the shore, this began as a tent, then became a crude timber building, and by this point was a small brick structure. But acknowledging the role and location of this building, and Meehan also no doubt looking towards the higher ground to his north and seeing what we now know as the Church Street Knoll, he made then the rectilinear the corresponding rectilinear alignment became Elizabeth Street. The focus of the plan and the centre of the town was to be a generous civic square, a space called George's Square. It was, of course, called a square, although in name alone. These offset alignments have generated a unique outcome where each urban block is a different proportion. While the streets, like the landforms of which they are a part, constantly reorient the viewer. Both of these alignments were seeking the imperial imprint of a uniform rectilinear military grid. But local topography asserted itself against that will. Notwithstanding the expectations for George's Square, Government House expanded along the escarpment, effectively creating a triangle of civic functions fronting the cove prior to reclamation. And we know the commissariat from 1808 in the sharp end of the triangle, in 1825 the courthouse in the bottom edge of the triangle, and then between them this rambling Government House. The growth of Government House gave rise to a rambling set of buildings that came to dominate the view down Elizabeth Street. In terminating the view, it also gave rise to its widened form between Collins and Macquarie. And I suggest if you haven't noticed this, next time you're in town, have a look. There's a distinct difference in the width of the street at Collins Street and that at Macquarie Street, and it was in order to focus the alignment to this edifice, sprawling edifice, but also the colonial focus of Government House. When the new Government House was opened at Pavilion Point in 1859, and after Elizabeth Street had been cut through to Davey to connect with the reclaimed edge of Franklin Wharf, the reduced area was returned again into a public space, becoming, as we've heard, Franklin Square, formally with the arrival of the statue in 1865. It's a civic garden with a strong axial symmetry as well as corner entries. But the geometry of the central ovoid shape owes much to the forecourt and symmetry of the public buildings on the other side of Murray Street. And that is because of the authority they represented police, courts and public offices. By the mid-1870s, when the main photograph was taken, the confident formality of Macquarie Street is increasingly evident. Self-government had happened. The garden-esque style of Franklin Square identifies the now cropped civic precinct between Town Hall and the Supreme Courts in the bottom corner. Notwithstanding the extensive plantings, Franklin Square still offered a vantage point, although the focus was obviously Macquarie Street. Some 15 years later, a statue of Dr. William Crowther was located in the northwest corner, the one closest to the Supreme Courts. Interesting. In what was at this time a significantly more densely planted space. When I took this photograph in 1981, across Franklin Square, it was possible to clearly connect with the spire of St George's Church on Battery Point and the Mount Nelson Hills beyond. One was able to effectively locate oneself within the regional scale of the city from its very civic centre, its primary focus. The nearby executive building in Davey Street, which I'm sure will become obvious, was not yet built. And when it was, ta-da, it was chamfered on its southwest corner to acknowledge this alignment. Possibly the first building in the city shaped to assist a deep view line. To maintain Franklin Square as a vantage point and place of orientation within a denser city centre, the southeast view line, and also one northwest from the centre of Franklin Square to Canungi, have been formalised by the city, an outcome of a wider study considering building heights. Another drawing from the planning scheme. But the point I'd like to make is Hobart is a small city in a large landscape. To continue to connect to and scale our shared landform horizons from the centre of settlement, which is, I think, what we take as our place of living here, specific judgments, policy needs to be made. One of these, I suggest, is to consider the city not merely as a collection of buildings, but as a location that itself needs to be revealed, including its hidden histories. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee, and I think you'll agree that Lee has taken our consideration of Franklin Square from perhaps where we have been a little bit stuck and overwhelmed by the sort of histories that Cassandra has so eloquently and entertainingly presented us this evening. Lee's been able to take us to an awareness of Franklin Square as a place with much broader dimensions, a place in a landscape that I think everyone here who's a resident of Hobart or close by will agree is very much part of defining not just the place that we live, but who we are. How many people who have got the ability to look towards the mountain don't do that almost every day to check on what's happening with the weather or watch the black cockatoos flying overhead. So I'd like to invite Cassandra and Lee to join us on stage once again. and we'll open the floor and online questions. I'm also pleased to welcome our final panel member, Lord Mayor Anna Reynolds. Councillor Reynolds is a strong advocate for public spaces that not only beautify our city, but also share the rich stories of our community. And has been instrumental in the careful and thorough process of addressing the subject of the Crowther statue and also the future of Franklin Square. Importantly, she's made the point on many occasions that the proposed removal of the statue was not about erasing history, but about acknowledging past wrongs and moving towards a more inclusive and respectful future. We look forward to Anna's insights on how public spaces can shape and reflect the identity of Hobart. So welcome, Anna. Before we go to our first question, I'd just like to, Anna, give you an opportunity to perhaps reflect on some of the matters that have been considered this evening.
Thank you. Yes, well, whenever there's an opportunity to talk about the stories of Hobart, I think we're always all surprised and we always learn something, and that's because we live in a pretty amazing little place that it is obviously the colonial Australia's second oldest city, and there's a huge, incredible amount of stories that can be told about the places that we live around. And Cassandra's stories and then Lee's reflections on understanding Franklin Square and how it sits in the grid of Hobart and in the landscape were just really fascinating. And I think the context for tonight really is Greg and I wanted to have a bit of a public discussion as much as anything about what next, because obviously Franklin Square and the Crowther statue project called Crowther Reinterpreted started around about, I think it was really early 2018, but you know, as Greg mentioned, some of the ideas that were being and discussions were happening even earlier than that. So the process was, I think, a very deep and reflective one. It involved the commissioning of 4 temporary artworks, as Greg talked about, several votes and several sort of consultations with the community, and then a decision by the Tasmanian Heritage Council, a decision by the tribunal, planning tribunal, so lots and lots of steps. But there are still some more steps to go in the project. When we agreed to do this, stage 3 was to install temporary interpretive signage, which will go in probably before the end of the year, and that will tell the story of William Crowther, more about the story of William Lanne, and just about the story of the process we've been going through over the last few years. But then stage 4 of the project, which Council has also agreed on, is that there'll be another interpretive work commissioned, and that also needs to tell those stories of Crowther and Lanne, but also some broader stories about those times in Hobart, and it'll be really interesting to see how we tell those stories and which stories are told. I think one of the stories that I think is really important about Franklin Square that hasn't come up tonight yet is that it was when Government House was in the place of Franklin Square, it was the place that the Frontier Wars ended. The free people came down Elizabeth Street after negotiating with George Augustus Robinson to come in to talk to the governor to negotiate a treaty. And that treaty was pretty much, I think, Greg will correct me if I'm wrong, probably one of the first treaties in colonial Australia, but it was a treaty that was never formalised, and of course we know that the promises made by Governor Arthur on that day were broken. And, you know, that that significance of that place and that story to Australia's and Tasmania's heritage is incredible as well. And yet that story is not told anywhere in Hobart at the moment, and certainly not in Franklin Square. So I think there's so many stories we want to tell in our city. There are so many interesting stories, interesting people, and Franklin Square is a really significant place. And I hope that tonight is a way to start talking about how do we tell a broader range of stories that tell a broader truth of our history in Franklin Square, but right around the city.
Thank you very much, Anna. Just to respond to Anna's comment about treaties, there were a number of promises and offers that were made with the authority of the Governor Arthur, through his agent George Augustus Robinson, that we know of, that were intended to broker deals and agreements with Aboriginal people in order to bring an end to conflict and warfare and armed resistance that the colony referred to at the time as the Black War. And the last of those, it was the subject of a painting that many of you will know from the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery by Benjamin Dutereau, commonly referred to as the Conciliation. Right on cue, thank you very much. This is a painting that I've been quite obsessed about and researching for nearly 20 years, and the centrepiece of a touring exhibition from the National Gallery of Australia that visited TMAG and QVMAG back in 2017. And it represents George Augustus Robinson meeting with the last armed resistance group, who were referred to at the time as the Big River Mob. And you know, the centrepiece of focus there is the handshake. Very powerful symbol in the 1830s and 40s when this painting was being composed, with resonance to emancipation, and it was certainly meant to signal that there had been a formal agreement which had led to the cessation of violence, at least in the Midlands and the southern parts of the state. Importantly for the conversation tonight, and Robinson records quite a bit of detail on this in his journals. He made an undertaking to Montpellier, the leader of that group, that if they were to accompany him to Hobart, he would arrange a meeting with the governor who would agree to their demands. Now, we know the detail of this because Robinson wrote this down and forwarded it ahead of the group's arrival in Hobart. And the governor did indeed receive that group of people at Government House. So Franklin Square is really a very critical place in terms of the end of the Black War, but also, sadly, the ultimate deception and betrayal of Aboriginal people, because instead of their demands being met, they were exiled to ultimately to Waibelena on Flinders Island, a place that I often refer to as Australia's first exercise in permanent offshore detention. I'd like to go to the audience, and if you could raise your hand if you have a question. I do ask that people confine themselves to questions rather than commentary.
Thank you for your discussion tonight. I gather that the end game for tonight is to get some inkling of what the public think should happen to Franklin Square without Mr. Crowther. My view is that it's a need for healing, and that we have had a lot of pain in facing white invasion in Tasmania, and people like you, Cassandra, have been telling us the truth of your family and the family of white invasion for a very long time. And we have been trying to get to grips with this. And I think about my own history of coming to a sense of peace. And the question I have is, would our Tasmanian public accept no acknowledgement of man's history here, but go back to the idea of nature and that missing tree that you talked about, Cassandra?
I wonder, both Cassandra and Lee, you might want to offer a few comments in response, because the proposal here is that perhaps healing can be best achieved by engaging more directly with the place, the natural qualities and values of the place, rather than burying ourselves even deeper in the troublesome colonial history. Lee, would you like to offer a comment first up?
Clarification there. Not in the absence of settlement is my assumption. And so the challenge, certainly for me as a built environment professional, is how to continue to delve into one's deeper appreciation of the place and its histories, whilst trying to better manage settlement. And settlement, and cities in particular, if they're not humane, well managed, and extremely well governed, then that which we might loosely call the rest, wild nature, particularly in this landmass, is threatened. We know that. So for me, cities are the solution, and it's also, albeit a reasonably obvious gesture, the landforms that have been shared by people for thousands of generations are the ones we are still managing within our city. And if we can manage them in ways that allow us to reflect through that time, then I believe that's a piece of sensible urban policy.
Cassandra, would you like to offer a comment?
I suppose the first thing that I would say is that Lady Macquarie's chair is a perfectly manicured and manufactured site, natural site. And apart from, certain undeniable features of the landscape, but more particularly what I would say is I cannot imagine how you could possibly imagine a place where there was no settlement of any kind. I mean, basically, as far as we know, the first people of Tasmania were here for an awfully long time. And I see no point in eradicating that. That's extremely significant. And, well, my position is quite clear. I want to see that rewritten back into our sense of ourselves. And I would, at this point, like to have a shout out to the Tasmanian Aboriginal community for the way in which they have insisted upon their presence here and insisted upon reading themselves back into the way in which we understand ourselves. And I suppose I put my colours out right here and now. I would like to see Franklin Square renamed, and I would like to see it as reconstructed, reimagined as a significant Aboriginal space.
Thank you, Cassandra. I'll go to an online question, and the question is, in terms of what next, should we be commissioning public artwork that is reflective of an inclusive community and find ways to make everyone feel welcome? Anna, any thoughts on that?
I think the answer is yes. It's ideal if public art can be meaningful to the broadest range of people. So not everyone might like it, but that it is inclusive and inspiring and tells a really important civic, particularly in civic squares or public places, it tells a really important story of that place. So that would be ideal to have that opportunity to do that. And it was interesting, Cassandra's comments about the boat sculpture that I hadn't really reflected on it. It's in terms of it being the Erebus. I'd always thought of it as a colonial boat, and just a more generic colonial boat. But the fact that it does. It's a great piece, and it's a really interesting piece. But we obviously public art is something that, as a small city, we don't have a huge budget for. So we do need to think carefully about what we do spend money on. But I think we're really keen to commission a piece, maybe not in Franklin Square, maybe somewhere else, that really is for the Tasmanian Aboriginal community to tell more of the story of the place before colonisation, a sort of major commission that really does delve more deeply into that part of the history of this place. But so that will be something that the council will need to consider in future budgets. But whether that's in Franklin Square, maybe not. Maybe it's somewhere else.
Thank you, Anna. We have take another question from the floor, and there was a lady up the back who had their hand up before.
Hello. I'm just wondering, you're talking about history, you're talking about Franklin being a no-hoper, basically, is what you implied, and also you've got Scott, who died, Shackleton, who died. They're not no-hopers, but I'm just wondering, in terms of history and respecting history, our history as well as everybody else's, stadium, wasn't that meant to be an Indigenous space? The goods shed, wanting to move it. You've got cenotaph, which is a history of people who gave their lives up. We're not respecting that. The heights of building, we're not respecting the views of Mount Wellington. Then you've got chairlift, not respecting the mountains, zip line. What are people going to say in generations to come? And then the mess on Campbell Street at the moment with, who knows, bike lanes and cars. And then you want to duplicate this on Collins Street. So Franklin, I don't think, is repugnant. He is a man of his time. Scott was a man of his time, everybody. But I think that we've got to be very careful about keeping on reinventing things, like putting a huge whopping stadium that you can see from Government House, and getting rid of a lot of history that we actually need to maintain for future generations, not just this generation. Thank you.
Judging from the round of applause, I think that comment is acceptable to everybody. But I do encourage you to put forward questions. We'll go to another question from the floor. Yes.
Good evening. My name is Chris Merridew, and I have been very strongly involved with the National Trust, as a lot of people will know, here in Hobart, and I ran a 3-year... Batteries gone flat? No. See that the Treasury buildings were retained in public ownership. Now, the Treasury buildings are very relevant to what we're talking about with Franklin Square. Down here? Okay. That's where the Australian Constitution was written by Inglis Clark, in those buildings. And that's the constitution by which Australia still operates. Charles Darwin, he was interested within the flora and the fauna of Tasmania. He had offices in those buildings. The Supreme Court, the oldest Supreme Court in Australia, are in the Treasury buildings. The Executive Council from which the state was governed until that building in Murray Street we saw just recently was built, the Executive Building. The Governor came from to those buildings in his Landau and 4 to deal with his cabinet in those Treasury, as we call them, buildings. The Executive Council building is still there, Executive Council rooms, exactly as was built in 1864 or thereabouts. Now, the reason that Crowther's statue was placed where it was and where he looked was that it was deemed that that was a recognition of Crowther looking to the future of his city, looking in the direction of Mount Wellington, looking up Macquarie Street, which, as we heard, is the main avenue for formal processions, as we still have on Anzac Day. He felt, possibly indicating what he had left in the city in terms of a much acclaimed purposes within the city, both not just his medical practice, where we know from archival work that he ran general practice for free settlers, for convicts, and for obviously the health of Indigenous people. He no doubt saved the lives of many of the Indigenous community. But as Councillor Reynolds has said tonight, and as Lord Mayor on various other occasions, we cannot change history. Now, I understand from the tribunal and from the council's recommendations that the pedestal remains. That remains irregardless of what else may happen in Franklin Square. That's a design that it remains. There are four faces on the pedestal, one in the gold print of Crowther and why the people of Hobart put him there. The suggestion has been that those plinths should be used to tell the story of Crowther on perhaps two of those faces on the pedestal, and the other two vacant faces, there are 3 vacant faces at the moment, be used for correctly archival research of the Aboriginal issues with perhaps Crowther. Now, my question is, the story should be written on those 4 plinths. It all relates to the heritage of that entire area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Cassandra?
As somebody who's spent a lot of my professional career working in other places, I'm always astonished when I come back to Tasmania, and I've been back here for a while now, at the extraordinary capacity for people to make the most extraordinary comments about Tasmanian history from a point of view of, I don't know, a bit of searching on Trove or just talking to their relatives. I'm not quite sure where it comes from. But the issue is, I've been pretty generous to William Crowther. I've been as generous to William Crowther as is possible to be, because I have done years of research. I have got on planes and I've gone to overseas museums and galleries and archives, and I have spent years of months and months, over 5 years, of getting the information about William Crowther, amongst other people. And what I can tell you is, William Crowther would have dealt with 1 Indigenous patient in his entire medical life, and that was William Lanne. Well, why do you not think that's true? What is your evidence for that? There is no evidence because there were no Indigenous people in Tasmania for him to be menacing to. It is also the case that I never made the point about Sir John Franklin being an ogre. I believe that I said that he was a kindly old man who was in thrall to his dominating wife, which was the generally held opinion. What I would say about both of them is they made a habit of collecting the human remains of the first people of this island. Now, you may make up your own mind about what you think about that, but I, as a historian, am not going to be silent when people tell me, oh, that didn't happen, or that couldn't have happened, or else invent another narrative altogether about how, these people would tended to Indigenous people. Let me tell you how doctors in Tasmania tended to Indigenous people. They waited till they died in the hospital, and then they took their human remains and sent them off to museums. That is what they did with them.
Thank you, Cassandra, and thank you, Chris. There is probably some space for some more focused research to be done on the provision of medical treatment to Aboriginal people. We'll go to a comment online, and Veronica, or Finn McShane, says, I applaud the interpretive work of Julie Goff and hope Franklin Square, renamed, will be a site for further interpretive work. But perhaps a static display or installation is a bit limited. How can we open this up and keep interpreting history, bearing in mind that history isn't static?
I don't know that I have an answer, but the city's not static either. And the comment before the previous comment was actually talking about the issues of managing the city, which are complex. They're ongoing. We live within a construct that we have to make more humane and better connected than it has been, and that is surely. But even going back to the previous comment, I don't believe in us depopulating the landmass of Tasmania in order to do that. Also the connections that we can still make are ones where we can recognise, for example, the shoreline at the point that Europeans colonised. That is quite achievable within this city. We then are able to have a datum for time of actually how little has been reclaimed relatively, but more importantly, it takes us back to the edge, to the escarpment, to the land before, which has been changed, but we need references to it in order to understand the place. And that is achievable even in an interpretive way within Franklin Square. It's certainly achievable within the rest of Sullivan's Cove. It's actually been part of the intent in more recent times in the Sullivan's Cove planning scheme, not as pursued as assiduously as it should be, but it's still the point that is still possible. And so if we seek to inform ourselves more deeply, not only about human presence, but the nature, in the deeper nature of this place, then we will find ways of actually interpreting it much more sensibly as the city develops.
Thank you, Lee. We're coming close to time, but I'd just like to go to at least one more question online and hopefully one more from the audience here. Interesting question. How can our colonial public art and architecture, and I think that the question is referring to existing architecture or perhaps future as well, how can it be used in truth-telling as we move towards reconciliation? Lee, do you want to start off, seeing as you're the architect?
I'll just go back to the point I've just made, I think buildings don't exist in isolation. Buildings are located. Architecture only exists if it's located. We fall into a trap if we think we can build our way into interpreting everything. And in fact, that is not what actually architecture is about. It's much more complex than that. And so I think the truth-telling is very much to do with revealing the place in which settlement occurs.
Thanks, Lee. And we'll go to one more question, and we're really running right on time now. So I urge a brief question. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. My question is referring to the first question in terms of inclusivity in art in public space. Just wondering, you've talked about this, but how do we stick with that uncomfortableness and perhaps bring along public sentiment to, how do we do that? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Anna, I might throw this one to you. Elected councillors are dealing with uncomfortable issues and have an obligation to consider public sentiment. How can we move forward in this space?
I mean, this is one of those issues that probably everyone in this room would have a different view, and the elected members around the table would have a range of views as well. But I think I think you have to invest in art and storytelling and truth-telling to get a broad range of views and a broad range of perspectives. And if you don't, then you end up getting what we got in Franklin Square, which is a random range of statues sort of that appeared because of particular points in history. Obviously, Cassandra's talked about Franklin's wife and her determination. The Crowther statue came out of its own particular story. We've only got one other premier that's featured in Hobart. We've got virtually no women. We've got some convict women, but there's no names on them. They're just kind of symbols of convict women. We've got more dogs, statues of dogs, than we do of women. So I guess and they're huskies from the Antarctic explorers. But yeah, my hope would be that that the public would see the value of spending more on public art, murals and sort of ephemeral art that just tells stories, and literature and poetry, and that's one of our challenges. Is I think there's plenty of stories and there's plenty of interest in the community in telling the stories of Hobart places, but there's probably an unwillingness from the community often to invest in commissioning art and paying artists properly and undertaking public art. It's not at a level high enough. It's often seen as wasted money and controversial, but personally I think it's a massively important investment in our community to invest in public art. For greater budget capacity to be able to invest in public art. I noticed that the City of Melbourne has recently called for expressions of interest for a $2.5 million public art commission to commemorate those who have lost their lives while working. And of course, those of you who are old enough to remember the building of the Westgate Bridge will understand why that's something that's very important in the heart and the memory of the City of Melbourne. The city, and particularly those people who work in cultural and public art programs, are really strongly committed not just to playing their part in investing in the cultural wealth and richness of the City of Hobart, but also in engaging with the public. So please keep your eye out for opportunities to make your voices heard, your critical voices, your encouraging voices. We do have the great benefit of living in a democratic society, and controversy is always a good reminder that we live in an uncertain world that we have to make meaning of collectively. Just a reminder that this talk will be. Cassandra, were you wanting to say something?
I was going to say that names don't cost anything. Naming doesn't cost money. Changing the names of places doesn't cost money.
Can I ask you all to now please join me in once again thanking our speakers tonight, Sandra Pybus, Lee Woolley and Anna Reynolds. And most importantly, thank you all to those of you who have taken the trouble to come here in person tonight, and also those of you who have joined us online. On behalf of the University of Tasmania, have a happy evening and a safe travel home. Good night.